So you've perhaps read the abstract that I wrote for this talk, and I hope that some of that is still going to be recognizable in the talk itself. The title, The Uses and Abuses of Critical Thinking, or How to be Placed on the Professor Watch List. And this is going to give my overview of the sort of things I think that make critical thinking important, and also the sort of things I think are worth flagging and emphasizing pedagogically in any class. Okay, so step one, teach students to think for themselves. 15 weeks is not enough time to master any complicated subject. So the goal is to prepare students to continue educating themselves once the course is over. Students should be comfortable challenging assumptions and questioning authority, but there's a responsible and right way to do this. And along those lines, I think it's important to introduce your students to heroes. This is easy in philosophy since the history of ideas is full of intellectual heroes. Heroes exist in every field and provide inspiration and instruction to students looking for guidance. Whenever possible, I don't just reference a philosopher's work. I introduce my students to that philosopher in critical conversation with other philosophers. These are guide dogs that you should all be turning to in your own field. They're the heroes who, of course, have questioned authority the correct way. Step two, reject relativism. Insist that facts matter. It is part of our job as educators to flag and defend factual claims. This is so even when it challenges the political and cultural assumptions students bring to class. Here's a quote that some of you may be familiar with. One thing that has been interesting this entire campaign season to watch is that people that say facts are facts, they're not really facts. This is by CNN contributor and Donald Trump supporter Scottie Nell Hughes on a recent episode of The Diane Rehm Show, November 30th. The claim above is relativistic. It's also self-refuting. Don't allow your classroom to be a hospitable environment for nonsense just because those in our public sphere are held to a low standard. Teach your students to tease out absurdities and to be charitable doing so. Reductio ad absurdum is a technique of analysis that involves taking a proposition seriously enough to check for fallacious or contradictory consequences. And this is the first rule of critical thinking I teach my critical thinking students. And I ask them to continuously use this throughout the term and to get in the habit of doing this all the time. When philosophers speak of being charitable, what we mean is that if we are to refute another position, we want to refute that position on its strongest terms so that if it's refuted well. And it's not strawmanned in any sense. That's what we mean by being charitable. And reductio ad absurdum requires you to be charitable because you must assume, if this were the case, what else would be the implications of that claim? So let's look at that. Is that a fact? One thing that has been interesting this entire campaign season to watch is that people that say facts are facts, they're not really facts. Facts aren't really facts. If the statement is true, then it's false. This makes it self-refuting. A self-refuting argument or a claim is self-refuting when its truth implies its own falsehood. When a claim is self-refuting, it's incoherent. It can't make sense. It might sound as if it makes sense, but it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make logical sense. And that leads me to step 3, take logic seriously. Rational people can disagree but they can't escape logic. Self-refuting arguments are only problems for those who have a commitment to logic. But if you want to argue against logic and still be understood, you'll have to employ logic. The only reason anything I'm saying makes sense at all is because it's logically coherent. And so respect logical constraints and teach your students to do so as well. The laws of logic and physics constrain us in all we do. Not everything is logically possible. It's not possible to draw in 2 dimensions a circle that is also a square. What is not logically possible is also not physically possible. Creative thinking is doomed to failure if it isn't grounded in critical thinking. Creative thinking emerges in the play space between what is logically possible and what is physically possible. To appreciate this, one must learn how to think critically and appreciate the constraints that inform creativity. If you haven't realized it by now, I want to put the critical in critical thinking, and that's going to be what I emphasize here. I ask my students in the course of teaching them about basic logic and the rules of logic to come up to the board if they so wish and draw a square circle. And I tell them if they can do so, they'll receive an automatic A and they don't need to show up for the rest of the term. And there's always a few, or at least one, who wants to give this a try, and they come up with really creative ways to draw a square circle, and they all fail. Because no matter how creative they are, it's logically impossible to do. And creativity must have the edge of logic to it to be useful. Step 4, cultivate intellectual humility. Reasoned inquiry is marked by a skeptical disposition to proportion one's beliefs to available evidence. In doing so, one embraces one's own fallibility and capacity for self-criticism. Reasoned skepticism or critical thinking may not bring us to all the answers, but it can uncover what the answers can't be. One of the Platonic dialogues that I am most fond of and ask my students to read most regularly is the Euthyphro. And in the Euthyphro, Socrates engages with a self-proclaimed theologian, Euthyphro, in a search to determine the meaning of piety. At the end of this dialogue, we still don't know what piety is, but we know what piety cannot be. And that is progress. Mind the boundaries of reason in yourself and others. Understanding the nature of fallibility, the constraints of logic, and our own epistemological limits fosters tolerance for diverse points of view. Understanding the nature of fallibility, the constraints of logic, and our own epistemological limits tempers toleration with the capacity to make critical judgments. I'm an ethicist, and I don't know how to provide an argument to anyone in this room that they ought to be compelled to follow by the force of rationality itself, as how to live the life that is best suited to ethics and to your overall views of the world and philosophy. But I can point out what actions you're considering are unsupportable and therefore beyond the pale of ethical justification. And again, that's progress. We can make a great deal of progress with critique alone. Step 4, be biased, but in the right way. Confirmation bias is the tendency to interpret evidence in support of our own preconceptions and ideological commitments. There is no escaping confirmation bias, but we can cultivate a commitment to behaving as someone who values the truth, regardless of its consequences. Education is about cultivating a bias for the truth. Thinking critically is the hard work necessary to maintain that bias against personal discomfort. If I identify primarily as a philosopher, as a thinker, my identity is vested with discovering the truth. And that's what motivates me. I'm biased towards the truth. My identity informs my view of the world. But you could work to create the appropriate identity to do that with. And that's, again, what I think education is for, in part. Which brings us to respect science and scientific consensus. I work on climate change issues and ethics, and this is a very big problem with those who seek to reject the overwhelming consensus of scientists regarding climate change and human-caused climate change. That, in fact, it is occurring, and we are responsible for the vast majority of it. Science is a rigorous, methodological, skeptical approach to learning about the natural world. It is organized in such a way as to protect researchers from their own confirmation bias at every step. When an overwhelming scientific consensus among active researchers in a field exists, it is often because attempts to disprove a particular claim have instead converged to strengthen its credibility. Science can get things wrong, and it does. And it catches those mistakes because that sort of skeptical vetting is woven into the methodology, and it works over time. As opposed to that pseudoscience, begins with a preferred outcome and then does everything to find evidence for that, and that's a disaster. In my critical thinking course, we often will juxtapose science, real science, against pseudoscientific things that are kind of silly, like ghost hunting or my favorite, ufology. And it's not because I think it's important for my students to be able to debunk a ghost claim or UFO sighting, but because the skeptical tools, the critical tools you use to debunk those are exactly the same ones you'll use to debunk important things, as I point out, like, are there weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? And that's the point of learning how to think rigorously and skeptically and scientifically. Step 5, cultivate appreciation of expertise. Arguments from expertise are not the same as fallacious appeals to authority. Without reliance on experts, complex modern societies are unsustainable, as we may soon be forced to recognize. By enrolling in a university, students will be exposed to experts in various fields, who ideally will teach students how to develop their own expertise in these fields. Why else should students enroll in college? And along those lines, I think this is an important quote that I always cover and share with my students in critical thinking, from Bertrand Russell on the value of skepticism in his Skeptical Essays, 1928. There are matters about which those who have investigated them are agreed. The dates of eclipses may serve as an illustration. There are other matters about which experts are not agreed. Even when the experts all agree, they may well be mistaken. Einstein's view as to the magnitude of the deflection of light by gravitation would have been rejected by all experts not many years ago. Yet it proved to be right. Nevertheless, the opinion of experts, when it is unanimous, must be accepted by non-experts as more likely to be right than the opposite opinion. The skepticism that I advocate amounts only to this. 1, that when the experts are agreed, the opposite opinion cannot be held to be certain. 2, that when they are not agreed, no opinion can be regarded as certain by a non-expert. And 3, that when they all hold that no sufficient grounds for a positive opinion exist, the ordinary man would do well to suspend his judgment. These propositions may seem mild, yet if accepted, they would absolutely revolutionize human life. I think he's right. And I think the opposite is true. If these are rejected, it will absolutely be a tragedy for human life and society. And I would point out that when he uses the word unanimous, if I were there to edit Bertrand, I would have pointed out that he means an overwhelming consensus, perhaps, because if we take Einstein as an expert, then it wasn't unanimous. But the general point still stands that expert opinion, when there's a consensus behind it, is a useful form of evidence and guide itself. And this doesn't preclude experts being wrong, of course. But as a layperson, that's where we should put our trust, and it's reasonable to do so. Step 6, avoid the wrong kind of bias. Study of the humanities. Teach students to communicate with others. Just as importantly, they teach students to pay attention to others. The humanities can cultivate broadness of mind and empathy. These are the characteristics that allow us and our students to function civilly and respectfully in an open, pluralistic society. And education is not merely career preparation, but preparation for responsible citizenship. In this regard, we all have a personal stake in our students' success. And to that effect, encourage an appreciation for argumentation. No one should make it through a university without learning how to argue civilly and productively with others. An intellectual argument is the opposite of a quarrel. Arguments and argumentation are the lifeblood of philosophy, but there are some rules that ought to be respected. Oops. Public arguments require public reason and a commitment to civility. The duty of civility discussed by philosopher John Rawls manifests in the procedural adoption of public reason. Such is the case because a pluralistic society divided by comprehensive metaphysical doctrines is the inevitable consequence of free inquiry in a non-repressive society. This plurality stems from a basic fact of logic. Logical validity is distinct from truth. Rational people can, do, and will disagree on certain topics. This leads to a crucial question of contemporary liberal political theory. And by liberal, as a philosopher, I mean the political philosophy that includes both Republicans and Democrats in this country. Whether they know it or not, they are both liberals. How are we to progress amicably as a people divided by comprehensive ideological differences? In a liberal democracy, it's not reasonable to settle legislative matters by appealing to the book of Genesis or to any comprehensively grounded religious text or doctrine for the following reasons. Reliance on a metaphysically contentious foundation in public debate guarantees an entrenched conflict that has the potential to undermine political and economic stability in the long term. Such tactics breed incivility in a morally pluralistic public sphere. Comprehensive ideological doctrines, as we have seen, have distorting effects on the public understanding of scientific and historical facts, especially when such doctrines are given uncritical voice in the public realm. Comprehensive divisions become enlarged and entrenched as political speech divides among epistemic and political battle lines. This is, in part, how an open society becomes dysfunctional. And step 7, reject cynicism and defend facts. Cynicism is intellectually lazy. Thinking critically has nothing to do with cynicism. Skeptical inquiry is productive. It does not involve doubt for the sake of doubt. It's easy for students, when they first learn about logical fallacies, to see them everywhere. As I tell my students An informal fallacy is a fallacy because of what is not presented with it. Reasoned argument, precise definitions, and supporting evidence. It bears repeating, reasoned skepticism is about proportioning belief to evidence. This implies recognizing and accepting evidence when it exists. When one denies the overwhelming consensus of climate scientists regarding human-caused climate change, one is not being skeptical. Rather, one is attempting to hide behind the cloak of skepticism. Science is skeptical. To reject something that has been skeptically vetted over and over again until a scientific consensus is reached is cynicism. It is better described as pseudo-skepticism than skepticism. And finally, defend facts doggedly. Don't encourage students to have an open mind. Instead, encourage them to cultivate proper circumspection and intellectual humility. An appreciation of one's own fallibility reaps the benefits of the open-minded approach without its pitfalls. In the face of pseudo-skepticism regarding human-caused climate change, evolution, or the safety of vaccinations, an open mind is more dangerous than useful. Don't hesitate to create intellectual tension among your students. Growing intellectually is not always comfortable. A recent graduate who holds all the same ideas she began with 4 years earlier upon entering college has not received a proper education. Critical thinking is the method and the goal of education. There you have it. 7 easy steps on how to be placed on the professor watch list. I'll take questions now.
So, Larry, thank you. You gave us the 7 easy steps, as you just said.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about melding different viewpoints and domains in this? For example, I imagine in your critical thinking class, you may have a student that is a science major, an engineering major, a computing major, someone from the arts, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So much of what we do at a university level is teaching them how to think related to those that are going to be in their domain.
Mm-hmm.
But much of what you are trying to do is getting them to see beyond that particular domain.
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with that?
Well, you know, it's actually easy. At least in the context of a critical thinking class dedicated to critical thinking, because students are there knowing that they're going to be given tools that they then can go out and apply in other domains. And that's the, explicit point of that course from the very beginning. And so in teaching that course, it's pretty straightforward and easy. And I'm clear with my students, and I tell them that I don't even like to use the term critical thinking. I like to tell them that I'm going to teach you how to be a good thinker. And their choice is to either be a good thinker or a poor thinker. And they're going to have to keep thinking the rest of their life. And so they're going to have to keep using these tools in all of these domains. And so have I addressed your question? I mean, the idea is that for me, the only thing to do is be very clear and explicit with students that I'm giving you the tools. Part of your responsibility now is to learn how to apply these tools in your domains and learn how to blend and mesh the different compartments of your life that you'll be traveling through.
Excellent, thank you.
How do you keep, or better yet, resolve when an argument goes from the thinking process to the emotional process, and you know that's a slippery slope.
Mm-hmm.
You can be a pure thinker and switch into the emotional thinker very quickly. How do you get back out of it, or what do you do to prevent getting into that? Because at the topics you discussed, religion and politics and climate change, quickly go from scientific to emotional.
Yeah.
And emotional is not always based in anything but your emotion and your personal feeling.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get out of that pitfall and how do you avoid that pitfall?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And what's worked for me has always been to be very upfront and clear with the rules for my students and tell them this is how we're going to argue in this class, and this is what's not acceptable, and this is what academic argument is, and this is what it isn't. And so the idea is that students and everybody naturally, I think, as you point out, slip from that mode of thinking about something more reasonably to that emotional sort of runaway train. And what we forget, perhaps, is that they don't necessarily come to us already knowing how to argue. And again, in a certain sense, I have an advantage when I'm teaching critical thinking because that's explicitly what the course is going to be about. But I think it's always worthwhile in all courses. And I do this in my other courses that aren't critical thinking as well. I have, at the very beginning of the semester, I have a class dedicated to how to argue and a little primer on basic logic. And after that, we could keep referring back to it throughout the year. Another thing is that I'm also very open with my students about my own opinions on views that we cover in class. And I tell them that they can disagree with me, and that's good, and they'll probably get a better grade for disagreeing with me and arguing with me in class, but I'm going to treat them like an adult, and I'm going to also point out the flaws in their own arguments, and that's going to be part of the learning process. So I hope that answers your question, but I find the best policy is to be upfront about these pitfalls and address them before the class even begins to roll, so we could always come back to that moment at the beginning where we lay down the rules. Go ahead.
In the beginning in your bio, you had said something about you being an ethicist.
Mm-hmm.
And in your critical thinking classes, moving on into the repercussions of what happens, the ethical repercussions of not thinking critically.
Mm-hmm.
If you have students, and I'm thinking, to play off of your question, that are coming in with a very strong ethical, their own ethics,
Mm-hmm.
based on the metaphysical, based on their religious beliefs,
Mhm.
that do not necessarily involve critical thinking, but involve a religious or philosophical foundation
Mhm.
without critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
How have you ever found it must be a little bit difficult to shake them loose into
Uh-huh.
saying, I'm not going to tell you not to do this. In this class, it's going to be a little different,
Mhm.
and you have to stick with reason. Aside from bringing me in, they will quote quantum mechanics
Yeah.
to you, for example,
Mhm.
as an example of something that cannot be logically reduced, and perhaps you can draw a square
Mhm.
circle
Mhm.
in the field of quantum mechanics.
Mhm.
So, do you ever run into that kind of a situation?
Well, the first part of your question, how do I kind of manage it when students want to argue, is really the same as I already said, and it really works for me. And it's just, look, as long as we, up front say, of course, rational people can disagree, and we all disagree, and of course we're in a pluralistic society, and of course it's good that we disagree, and of course if I don't have the same belief system as you, I'm not going to understand your arguments. So that, of course, if you want to be understood, you have to learn how to speak to people. And I think students genuinely want to be able to make good arguments, and if you put it in that way that you're helping them to learn how to make a good argument, then they tend to try to stick with it. Almost every critical thinking class, when we go over the laws of logic, I get the quantum physics question, and I point out to them that physicists themselves will be the first ones to tell you that quantum physics is very weird. And there's a famous quote that if you understand it, you think you understand it, you don't. And I point out to them that what we may be dealing with, and I also point out to them, I'm a philosopher, not a physicist, but what we may be dealing with is an epistemological limitation in our ability to understand what we're observing, and we ought to refrain from drawing conclusions, radical conclusions, that somehow physics has undermined the laws of logic, especially since everything else we know about physics has been propped up and predicated upon those laws of logic's holding. And that usually is enough to make them think that maybe I shouldn't rush into to this conclusion that maybe logic doesn't still demand my respect. So again, cultivating the intellectual humility, right? That it might be that we just aren't understanding what we're thinking we're understanding in this case well enough. Jack.
Strikes me that recent public events might reflect a kind of an impatience on the part of at least a sizable minority of people with at least a visceral impatience with the very principles of liberal democracy that
Yes.
underlie our approach. You run into that in class. You find that students, I don't know how you'd be explicit about it, but you find that students are just simply impatient. They just don't want this whole business about trying to reach public agreement is somehow way too liberal for them.
I might be living in my own sort of teaching bubble with the students that are attracted to my classes, perhaps. I don't know, but all I could do is reiterate is that what works for me is being really honest with my students and the conservative ones as well. And I tell them, here's what I think. We can argue, and we should argue, and I'm going to treat you as an adult. And as long as I'm careful to always do that, I think they welcome the opportunity to argue. And I think that's part of good pedagogy. It's just they are adults. And what they do in my class, I'm going to want them to learn to do in the public. And so it just works out to keep emphasizing it. And I haven't had a big problem. I mean, there are some students who are more challenging than others. But so far, I find that the best tactic is not trying to be neutral and hide my own persuasion to my students. I find the best tactic is being completely honest and open with them and then letting them challenge me. And I think that's satisfying to them to feel that they could challenge me, class.
In my own experience, some of the most eager and delighted and hardworking students are sometimes the ones that come in thinking that they don't want any part of this.
Yeah, I find that students that, insofar as they perhaps think that they don't embrace the liberal democracy that I argue for in some of my classes, I find that they often, by the end of the term, come to realize that they're actually part of that tradition themselves. And it's a good experience.
Violated by liberals.
Right, yeah. That's what education is for. changing ideas people come into class with. Yes.
Thank you, Larry. Fantastic presentation.
Thanks.
Obviously. I want to raise a larger issue. I consider this course to be absolutely critical for our students, of absolute necessity, regardless of the major. And maybe there's a larger conversation that we need to have as a university of which are the quote-unquote required, maybe without quotes, which are the required courses, not just, for the, what kind of, I guess, my other question is, what kind of student, what is your average student? Do you get a fourth-year student, a third-year student? Because I would love to see first, and maybe at most second-year students, to be required to take a course like that. Because I teach position argument, I teach argument change, and see how inadequately the students are prepared for any kind of.
Yeah. I get a mix of students in the course. It's predominantly freshmen and second-year students. And I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, if I had my way, this would be a required course for everyone, that you wouldn't go through 4 years of undergraduate curriculum without taking a critical thinking class. Yeah, I think, it's the best method is to bring the student to the class. I mean, yes, we want to infuse it throughout the curriculum, but what works really well too is doing that while you bring the students to the specific curriculum designed to teach that skill as well. So yeah, all I could say is, I agree, let's keep saying that.
So perhaps maybe some formal steps we can undertake in
Uh-huh.
the near future to have these formal
Yeah,
conversations.
I hope so. I hope enough faculty, decide to maybe find ways to make those steps. I don't know what those steps would be, honestly, myself, but I think it's worth pursuing. John.
I had a question about the quote from the comments.
Would you like me to go back to it?
Mind? So, I wasn't sure about the context. But so I was trying to read it. I was trying to read it cheerfully. It sounded like what she was saying was there's some things that people thought were facts, but weren't really facts. And so I guess in that concept there were two questions I have. So if someone's denying that something is a fact, we're doing it from two different standpoints. One would be to say, well, you have your facts and I have my facts, and our so-called facts disagree with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Another way would be for someone to say, well, this is an area where there are no facts. You think there are facts here, but there are no facts. And that's something I do
Mhm.
with students fairly frequently. We're comfortable with the idea of there being mathematical facts, logical facts, scientific facts. But then when it comes to the normative realm of
Mhm.
ethics and politics, they say, that's not a fact-free area.
Mhm. Yeah.
Facts.
Yeah.
So I guess, so she says that people say facts are facts, they're not really facts. I'd rather be saying,
Uh-huh.
you think that these are facts, they're not really the facts.
Yeah.
Which actually seems, that doesn't seem illogical. That seems like fine.
Mhm.
Yeah, we do something, but there are facts, that they're not facts.
Yeah.
We've made a mistake.
Yeah.
But then the question is, well, what if the person comes back and says, this is an area where there are no facts,
Mhm.
because it's normative.
Right.
How do you get traction?
So good question. Two things in the larger context of this. I believe it's a discussion of fake news and the influence of fake news on the recent election, and so things like Pizzagate, things like all these weird conspiracy theories from climate denial to everything. So I think in this context, it really is making a very crudely relativistic claim about facts, unbelievably so. But you're raising a more interesting point in the second part about the fact-value distinction, I think. And at least that's how I address it to my students. And we cover that when we're talking about Socrates. And the way I pitch Socrates to my students in critical thinking in the context of sophism, right? In the rhetoric of the ancient sophists, is that Socrates is offering an agnostic, skeptical alternative to relativism that also may not come up with any facts, but is more capable of articulating what can't be justified as even plausible. And so the Socratic wisdom is, of course, a knowledge of one's own ignorance, and then the humility hopefully I want to instill in my students in recognizing that. So the way I try to get traction in the realm of the fact-value distinction is by embracing pluralism and acknowledging that, again, rational people can disagree. And when it comes to fact claims and value claims, fact claims are one thing, but value claims are more conducive to a rational disagreement. Nevertheless, that comes with limitations in terms of what can be justified in a pluralistic and open society with regard to others. And my take on that is that if I take a skeptical perspective and I find that there are certain things that I can't justify in a reasonable way with regarding my behavior to others, then those actions aren't justifiable and I ought not to try to push my actions on others. I think that's enough to avoid relativism. But it still acknowledges that we may not have the ultimate answer. So does that answer what you're getting at?
Could I
Yeah.
read the entire quote? Because there's more that you pulled out. part of it.
If you must, yes, go
So
ahead.
you pulled out part of it, which
Yeah.
supports the kind of question he asked, but it's
Uh-huh.
not the whole thing. I'm not gonna read the whole thing.
Please do.
What it says is immediately after saying this, everybody has a way. It's kind of like looking at rating,
Yeah.
or looking at a glass of full water, half full water. Everyone has a way of interpreting them to be true or not true.
Mhm.
There's no such thing, unfortunately, anymore, of facts.
Yeah.
And so Mr. Trump's tweet amongst a certain crowd, a large part of the population, are true.
Yeah. Scary.
That provides a slightly
Yeah.
larger context.
Also, there's a conflation, I think, perhaps, between one type of relativism, which I think is more problematic, versus what might be called contextual or conceptual relativism, like this glass is half full or half empty. We might still agree that there's a certain amount of liquid in that glass that can be measured. So I think that's less problematic, but I think, as you read, there's more there than just that's being said. Tim?
Thanks, Larry. As always, impeccably clear. I wondered if you might be able to go back to the slide on creative thinking and creativity. I think that might be the only place where I felt I might be falling off your 7-step wagon.
Okay. We'll try to get you back on.
Maybe not. But it seems as if you were saying that creativity and creative thinking is somehow responsible to what's physically and logically possible.
Mhm.
And I wanted to ask if you might amend that slightly so that creative thinkers who actively and purposefully disrespect what's physically and logically possible might have, in fact, a lot to contribute.
Mhm.
I mean, I imagine, for example, somebody writing science fiction or a novel of various sorts would create possible forms of thinking that are happily not reducible to what's presently understood to be physically or logically possible.
Mhm.
That may be a good vantage point from which to assess critically some of what we do presently endure in our society. Would you be willing to sort of suggest that creative thinking might not be, even in the science of education,
Yeah.
sort of reducible to evidence and logic?
Sure. I would amend it with regard to fiction, but I would also provide the proviso that, and this may be personal taste, I find the best science fiction to be the science fiction that's most mindful of the constraints of physical and logical laws. But that's a matter of mere taste. Now, what I'm saying, and what I want to be the salient point here, is that I think we often confuse the task of critical thinking and creative thinking. I don't think creative thinking is something that's easily taught, but I think that what we can do is emphasize critical thinking, and I think when students have a good grasp of critical thinking, they're better positioned in the long run to be more creative because they understand the constraints that I think ultimately provide the challenges one must be creative against. And I think so the best way in my mind to teach creative thinking is to emphasize critical thinking because I think the best forms of creativity are mindful of those constraints. Does that make sense? By analogy, not in the realm of science fiction, but let's say technology or anything moving forward in society, it's just a fact. Whether or not we do this remains to be seen, but it's a fact that all of our decisions in society now ought to be made within the creative constraint of climate change. That's just reasonable and sensible, and we don't seem to be doing that, but I think you have to, or we ought to be guiding students to the importance of understanding that they're not just going to flourish as creative thinkers if they don't first understand the rules that they're going to be creating up against or in the context of. So, yes.
You want to flip the coin, or?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was just thinking, like Elena, about I was teaching fourth year students, and we still spent a lot of the semester just trying to recognize what an argument is. So I think they have a hard time discerning opinion from argument, and they're actually not sure what facts are, and perhaps it's in part due to the political climate. But I think this is incredibly valuable, and I didn't know if you have any specific suggestions for helping students discern what an argument is.
Yeah.
So that they could, I think it's when you study for a PhD in the humanities, you get so good at recognizing arguments and trying to evaluate them that sometimes it's hard to go back to being like a freshman in college. And so if you have any advice for all of us about how to help students be able to discern what is an argument and how to engage with it.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that very point is exactly why I agree with Elena that we should just require critical thinking, and because we have other things we want to teach, and so it slows down the curriculum when we have to go back with remedial things like what is an argument, but we can't assume that students come to us with those. So what I do in my other classes often is I dedicate one lecture at least to just outlining the very basics of what an argument is and how we're going to proceed in this class. And sometimes I'll pair that with Monty Python's Argument Clinic, because then you do have an example of what doesn't count as a good argument, like mere contradiction or ad hominem attack. And of course, the definition of a logical argument is in Monty Python's Argument Clinic as a definitive set of statements in support of another definitive claim, right? So that's one suggestion to make it maybe fun. But of course, pairing that video with a potted lecture on argument and basic logic. Wait.
Just add to that.
Yeah.
When you get students, fourth year, third year, whatever, ask them for the reasons why they hold the views that they hold,
Mm-hmm.
and then start writing them up on the board
Mm-hmm.
with the conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
That's an argument.
Mhm.
What you will discover, it's probably not a very good argument, so you can then ask them, this doesn't look to be quite complete. Do you want to add some more to it? Other people want to help?
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly you have the class engaged in creating an argument.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I think there's a fairly simple response to the students who are unable to recognize arguments.
Mhm.
Is what are you holding? That's your conclusion.
Mhm.
Let's see what your reasons are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Say it's even more basic than that,
Yeah.
though. With the information age our kids live off of, they think facts are what they can get off Facebook, email, internet, which are not facts. So now they think they can argue from a position of fact when, in truth, they're arguing from a position of someone else's opinion.
Absolutely.
So the actual, when you say facts, facts means different things to different people. These kids live on these electronic devices. They, in my estimation, have a very demented view of the real world. Because of the fact that they don't interact enough with anything but the textual word or someone else's opinion of what they've seen or observed or feel.
Mm-hmm. And the social media medium doesn't necessarily lend itself to back and forth arguments. It lends itself to declarative statements, right? So yeah.
This basically is following on the details of that. Obviously, in a critical thinking classroom, it's very important to make sure that your students have the confidence to actually come forward with their thoughts and ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So, have you found a successful way, maybe going back to some of the philosophers who speak to basic respect for one's humanity, in how to ensure that even though you're disagreeing with someone, be it you disagreeing with them, because clearly you're in a position of authority in the
Mhm.
classroom, it needs to be a safe space for them to actively disagree with you, but still feel respected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and once again, the thing that I find works best for me is to have that conversation up front. That this is a course that I want to be. This is a place that, and I do use the words safe place. This is safe for you to disagree with me here, and to disagree with each other, and to disagree with the philosophers we'll be covering. And in fact, that's part of what you ought to be doing in the course. And it's easy in philosophy to a certain sense, because that's what we're doing in philosophy, is we're learning how to argue, and philosophy is one long historical argument. And it really becomes the case that you have these models, and I'm presenting them with these models who are engaged in an argument, and I'm asking them to do so, and to argue with them. So I guess what I try to do is create the culture of argument and let them understand that argument is actually a good thing. And in academics, argument is a good thing. And it's not a quarrel, as I said. And I think that these sorts of conversations have to become part of the classroom culture. And I think that gets set very early on in the class. And so that's my advice. Wade.
I haven't taught elementary logic a very long time, but one of the things I do the same thing you do at the beginning of each class. We show Monty Python's argument clinic, many of whom students can now recite it by heart. Unfortunately, there was a time when they couldn't. And what I then do is provide an argument, and I ask them to fill in the conclusion. The argument's a very straightforward one. My dog Scout is white or brown. She's not white, therefore. That's your first question. And we end up having a very long discussion because they just assume it's a trick question. And I'm saying, no, it's not a trick question. And your whole grade depends. Think of the rabbit asking the question in the middle of the grade. Your life depends on this. What were you going to answer? And they'll almost always answer that since she's not white, she must be brown. Okay, so she's brown. Second question is, what color is Scout? Everybody agrees that she's brown. And then we have a discussion about the difference between validity and soundness. And then people get pissed at me because they say, you lied to me. You lied. You said she was brown or white. She's not white, so she must be brown. I didn't lie. I wrote something up on the board. Instantly, you get into, I'm just up here.
Yeah.
I'm not an authority. If you want to go after me for this, that's fine. But you're wrong. I didn't lie to you. And we're on a different footing.
Yeah.
So part of what I'm after here is something, a different way of thinking about teaching critical thinking. And some of this comes out of the thinking fast and slow stuff. And that is that we either frame stuff in certain sorts of ways, we end up in false dilemmas. Don't even realize we're in a false dilemma. I had one student who, at the end of a course in professional ethics, said to me, I use moral and ethics interchangeably, you can't use moral like that. This is the 15th week of a 16th-week course. And I said, sorry, what? And he said, you can't do that. And I said, why not? And he said, because what's moral is what I believe. And I said, so you're the arbiter of what's moral? He says, no, when I believe it, that's what's moral. So it's moral that it's okay to cheat on exams. I said, so what am I supposed to do? Well, you can believe the opposite if you want. It's moral for you. And there's obviously a mistake here, and that is the fact that he believes this doesn't make what he believes true. But it's a mistake that's a relatively common one. I'm actually wondering if it would be worthwhile exploring the kinds of fallacies people get caught up in, which turn out to be very natural fallacies. Either or. Or if you take your bad for and allow them to work through why these are fallacies. And maybe that'll help solve the kinds of problems we've had in later years that students don't recognize it.
Yeah.
It's a different way of going about it.
And I think the challenge of that is finding the time to do it in a class that isn't dedicated to informal logic, for instance. Which is, again, comes back to the idea that this is why I think students should just be forced to take the class. But it is the case that the concept of validity is one of the most challenging ones to students if they haven't had this sort of drilled down into them.
Could I add one more comment
Yeah.
to this? When I did this, I used to have a fallacy of the week.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started off with a fallacy of the week. And at the end of the week, we'd go through this paper. I then asked all the students to find me fallacies and to give them to me on Thursday. And to me on Thursday.
Yeah.
And I'd go through them and pick out what I thought was a good fallacy.
Yeah.
And they're required to do this. And amazingly enough, they have to be pretty good at this. So it was a way of teaching them a skill which they otherwise might not have thought. And some of the fallacies were just hilarious, to say the least. All right, very funny.
Yeah. And I'll just add, one of the challenges is that students are bombarded by fallacies all the time in TV ads and commercials. I mean, they're effective because they're persuasive, and that's why they survive. Right? And so it's very difficult in a short amount of time to interrupt that constant bombardment and sort of arm them to start thinking critically about what they're experiencing. That's a challenge. I think a more systemic approach is the way to go. But yeah, these little techniques, however we could sort of put them into the classroom in guerrilla attempts to critical thinking, are all worthwhile. Yes.
I wanted to, you asked for advice, right? And I just wanted to share one tactic with you and with everyone else. Because we are in career-oriented university, right? It's all about you get the job right out of college and all that good stuff, or even trying to graduate faster for some reason. I always put it in the career sort of framework. If they write any paper or paper, especially proposal for change or argument, position argument paper, I say, will you imagine yourself standing in front of the audience that is holding the opposite point of view?
Mm-hmm.
Or sometimes a hostile audience. The goal of argument is not victory but progress.
Mhm.
After you finish delivering your paper, reading it out loud, I want you to make sure that the people in the hall are going to be engaged in dialogue with you.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you just wrote? Is there going to be dialogue at the end of the day? And I think when you put it in those terms, you hold them responsible for creating a dialogue, because it's not a victory. And some of them do want victory, especially first-year students. They are very emotional about those issues, and they want to win. And if you put it in terms of progress versus victory, dialogue versus victory, yeah. And I sometimes ask them to pretend to be a hostile audience member.
Mm-hmm.
Getting them to realize that sometimes the victory is in the dialogue.
And also, I think, going back to something I said about education in part being a way to help develop a self-conception as a thinker and identify as one, so that eventually is something they're proud of, and they don't want to be someone who could be so easily pigeonholed or boxed into one position or the other, but somebody who is just guided by a desire for the truth. And so, I mean, philosophy, that's the thing. I mean, that's what philosophers like to pride themselves on. So it's easy if you're dealing with students who are drawn to philosophy. But I think in all academic fields, we could model ourselves as thinkers, and that we should encourage our students to identify first and foremost as thinkers. And I think take advantage of bias that comes along with how one identifies oneself, by helping them to identify themselves as something or someone who is more prone to look for the truth and question their own assumptions. Yeah. Adam, did you have your hand up? Or?
The idea of critical thinking as oriented toward preparation for civic participation seems, at least at some level, to presuppose that there is something like a viable, responsive public sphere. And my sense is that most students' experience of the adult world is not an experience in which there is something like a viable, functional, responsive public sphere. And I was just wondering if that thought is something that is possible to integrate into the curriculum of critical thinking education, such that the classroom doesn't become a sort of isolated and sort of insular exercise in academic acrobatics, nor one that generates the sort of fantasy that adult life more broadly, professionally, culturally, etc., is going to be open and available to, let alone responsive to, the sorts of virtues and aptitudes that critical thinking
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question, and a bigger societal sort of issue. But I certainly pitch it that way. But with the idea that, and because I tell them straightforwardly in a critical thinking class that the reason I care that you're taking this class is because you have to think. You can't help yourself. You're either going to be good at it or bad at it, and I have a selfish vested interest in you being able to think, because we're in the same society where we each get an equal vote. And I continue that theme throughout the class, so that, at least from my explicit point of view, I'm training them for citizenhood. However, with that comes a continuous sort of emphasis, that it comes with responsibilities and hard work. And so no illusions. Thinking is difficult. Thinking is challenging. Functioning well in society is difficult. Functioning well in a democratic society and having a democratic society that functions well is difficult. And none of it's going to work out with laziness, either intellectual laziness or civic laziness. And so, yeah, I'm just unabashed about it. And that's the only thing I think that has a chance of working, is just being unapologetic about what I'm up to in the class. And it's not career preparation. It's definitely civic engagement.
Before I came to RIT, I spent several decades preparing or teaching the minds that, for the 2 years that happen before you get them in English. And I found that as part of that, when you're asking for evidence for essays, when you're looking for RIP exam or whatever, they needed to be able to understand how to critically think about something as opposed to take a concept that wasn't supported. I found, and I'm hearing people say, well, they need, this course should be taken early.
Yeah.
But that as they get into the later studies, they really can't understand, or they don't see that they were very capable of understanding the difference between a critically reasoned thought when you held them to it, but it became easier, it was intellectually easier to work with something that was not necessarily critically thinking. And that was my whole, it was easier. The intellectual rigor of providing a critically thought out argument was something they absolutely could do when motivated and wanting to. So it makes me sad as a high school English teacher to hear that they don't carry that necessarily in. But I just don't want people to accept the fact that, oh, they're on Facebook and they can't, or that. No, they really can. They are, at your point of them being adults, they really can. But sometimes they're allowed to get away with a little bit of ease.
Yeah.
And they should be helped.
That's an important point. I mean, they receive top-down messages from us, and they'll get away with what they can get away with if they think we're not going to hold them to a certain standard. I mean, it's a funny line that I always tell my students and get a laugh out of them with in my political philosophy class, is that I'm going to hold them to a higher standard than publicly elected officials are held to. And they think, haha, but I'm so serious about that because obviously they're not held to very high standards. And we just have to be consistent about what we expect out of them. And I think they appreciate it. Thanks. Thanks for coming.